The crack of gunfire echoed through the barren landscape as Holden Everett pressed himself against the dusty ground, his weathered face pressed into the dirt as bullets sailed overhead. It wasn't the first time he'd found himself in such a predicament, and he reckoned it wouldn't be the last. The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory was as unforgiving as the men who sought to tame it. "Damn it all," Holden muttered, checking the chambers of his Colt revolver. 3 bullets left. He'd have to make them count. The outlaws who'd ambushed him were after his horse and whatever meager possessions. He carried standard practice in these parts where law was more suggestion than rule. At 32, Holden had spent more than half his life drifting across the frontier. Tall and lean with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of faded denim, he wore his years like the leather vest on his back, worn but serviceable. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray at the temples, hung just past his collar, often hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. "Come on out, cowboy," a gruff voice called. "We ain't got all day, and neither do you." Holden took a steadying breath. "I reckon I've got all the time in the world," he called back, his voice carrying across the sparse terrain. "Can't say the same for you boys if you don't turn around and ride away." Laughter was his answer, followed by another spray of bullets. One ricocheted off a nearby rock, sending fragments dancing dangerously close to his face. Holden closed his eyes briefly. He didn't want to kill anyone today, but these men weren't leaving him much choice. In a swift motion born from years of practice, he rose to one knee, took aim, and fired. A cry of pain told him he'd hit his mark. His second shot found another target, and the third sent the remaining outlaws scrambling for their horses. "Next time, pick someone who looks worth robbing," he shouted after them, relief washing through him despite the bravado in his voice. As the dust settled, Holden retrieved his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Buck, from where he'd hidden him in a nearby gully. The animal snorted, clearly unimpressed with the day's excitement. "I know, old friend," Holden said, patting Buck's neck. "Time to find somewhere quieter." According to his reckoning, the town of Clearwater was less than a day's ride. He'd never been there before, but towns were mostly the same, a place to rest, resupply, and move on. That had been his way for years, ever since leaving Kentucky after the war. Home was wherever he laid his bedroll, and he preferred it that way. No attachments meant no disappointments. As he rode, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling prairie. The autumn air had a bite to it, reminding him that winter wasn't far off. He'd need to find steady work soon if he wanted to avoid freezing come December. Perhaps Clearwater would have something to offer. The town appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set, a collection of wooden structures clinging to existence on the edge of the wilderness. Main Street was quiet as Holden rode in, with only a few townsfolk hurrying to finish their business before nightfall. The usual establishments lined the dirt road: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a sheriff's office. Holden dismounted in front of the livery stable, his muscles stiff from the long ride. A boy of about 16 emerged from the shadowy interior, wiping his hands on already filthy trousers. "Take good care of him," Holden said, handing over the reins and a coin. "He's had a rough day." The boy nodded, eyeing both Buck and Holden with equal parts curiosity and caution. "Yes, sir. You staying long?" "Haven't decided yet. If you're looking for work, might try the Diamond M Ranch. They're always short-handed this time of year." Holden tipped his hat in thanks. "Might do that." "Where's your best place for a meal and a bed?" "Mrs. Peterson's boarding house is decent enough." "Down at the end of the street, white house with blue shutters. Food's better than the hotel and cheaper too." After collecting his saddlebags, Holden made his way down the street, aware of curious glances from the townspeople. Strangers were always subject to scrutiny in places like this, where everyone knew everyone else's business. He kept his head down and his hand close to his gun, not threatening, just cautious. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house was exactly as described, somewhat worn around the edges but clean and well maintained. The porch steps creaked as he climbed them, and the knock he delivered to the door was answered promptly by a plump, gray-haired woman with shrewd eyes. "Looking for a room, I expect," she said without preamble. $2 a week, includes breakfast and supper. No drinking, no fighting, no women in your room, pay in advance." "Yes, madam," Holden replied, digging into his pocket for the money. "Just passing through." She took the bills with a nod. "They all say that. I'm Mrs. Peterson. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you'll go hungry." "Rooms upstairs, second door on the right." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window that overlooked the street. Holden set his saddlebags on the bed and his rifle against the wall. Then he poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed the dust of the trail from his face and hands. The mirror above the washstand reflected a face he sometimes barely recognized, weathered and guarded, with lines around the eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and too many nights without proper rest. He ran a hand over the stubble on his jaw, deciding a shave could wait until morning. Supper was a simple but hearty affair: beef stew, biscuits, and apple pie served in the dining room downstairs. Besides Mrs. Peterson, there were only 2 other boarders, an aging drummer selling patent medicines and a young schoolteacher who barely looked up from his book during the meal. "You got business in Clearwater, Mr. Everett?" Mrs. Peterson asked as she refilled his coffee cup. "Looking for work," Holden replied. "Boy at the livery mentioned Diamond M Ranch." The landlady nodded. "Marcus Montgomery's place. Good man, fair employer. His daughter runs most of it these days, though, since his accident." "That's so. Grace Montgomery took over after her daddy got thrown from his horse 2 years back. Broke his back, he did. Can still get around some with a cane, but she's the one making decisions now." Holden absorbed this information silently. A woman running a cattle ranch was unusual but not unheard of in these parts. Life on the frontier made pragmatists of everyone, regardless of gender. "Ranch is about 5 miles north," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Can't miss it. Biggest spread in the county." After dinner, Holden stepped out onto the porch for a smoke, watching as the last light faded from the western sky. Clearwater settled into the quiet routine of a small town after dark: a few lights in windows, muted piano music from the saloon down the street, the occasional burst of laughter or raised voice quickly swallowed by the vast silence of the prairie. It was a scene he'd witnessed countless times in countless towns across the West. Yet something about this place tugged at him differently, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it was just weariness, the accumulated weight of years spent wandering. As he finished his cigarette, a woman hurried past on the boardwalk, her face hidden beneath the hood of her cloak. She carried a basket covered with a cloth and moved with purpose, not slowing even when she passed under the glow of a street lamp. Holden found himself watching her until she disappeared around a corner, struck by the odd sense of determination in her step at this hour. Not his business, he reminded himself. Nothing in this town was his business. He was just passing through, same as always. Morning arrived with a pale sun and the smell of frost in the air. After breakfast, Holden collected Buck from the livery and rode north out of town, following Mrs. Peterson's directions to the Diamond M Ranch. The landscape opened up before him, rolling grasslands punctuated by stands of cottonwood trees along a winding creek. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden autumn grass. It was good land, the kind a man could build something lasting on if he were so inclined. The ranch house came into view after about an hour's ride, a substantial two-story structure of timber and stone, with several outbuildings clustered nearby. A corral held a dozen or more horses, and smoke rose from the chimney of what appeared to be a bunkhouse. As Holden approached, a man emerged from the barn leading a dappled gray mare. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. "Help you, stranger," the man called, his hand casually dropping to the revolver at his hip. Holden reined Buck to a stop and raised his hand in greeting. "Looking for work? Heard in town you might be hiring." The man squinted at him for a moment, then nodded. "Might be. Foreman's out with most of the boys, moving cattle to the winter pasture. Miss Montgomery handles the hiring." "She around? Up at the house?" The man gestured with his chin. "Just don't track mud on her floors. She's particular about that." Holden dismounted and tied Buck to a hitching post near the house. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. Then he climbed the steps to the wide porch and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was not what he expected. Grace Montgomery stood about average height, with chestnut hair pulled back from a face that was more handsome than beautiful, marked by intelligence and a certain stubborn set to her jaw. Her eyes were a striking green, regarding him with frank assessment. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice containing none of the delicacy typically affected by town women. This was someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. "Madam," Holden said, hat in hand, "I'm looking for work. Name's Holden Everett." She considered him for a moment. "You have experience with cattle, Mr. Everett?" "Yes, madam. Worked ranches in Texas and Colorado. Drove herds up to Abilene more times than I care to count." "Can you read and write?" The question surprised him. "Yes, madam." "Good, come in then. My father will want to meet you." She led him into a spacious front room furnished with an eclectic mix of frontier practicality and Eastern refinement, sturdy wooden furniture, alongside delicate pieces that must have been shipped at great expense. A fire burned in a large stone fireplace, beating back the morning chill. Seated in a wheelchair near the fire was an older man with a shock of white hair and the same green eyes as his daughter. He looked up as they entered, his gaze sharp despite the frailty evident in his thin frame. "Papa, this is Mr. Holden Everett. He's looking for work," Grace said. "Mr. Everett, my father, Marcus Montgomery." The older man extended his hand, his grip still surprisingly strong. "Sit down, young man. Where are you from?" "All over, sir. Originally Kentucky." "What brings you to Clearwater?" Holden chose his words carefully. "Just looking for honest work." "Winter's coming." Marcus exchanged a glance with his daughter. "We can use another hand, especially one who can read. Half my cowboys can't tell their names from a wanted poster." Grace nodded, though her expression remained reserved. "The winter drive starts tomorrow. $5 a week plus room and board. You'll bunk with the other men." "That's fair," Holden said, surprised at how quickly the matter was settled. "Ben will show you around," she continued. "He's the man you met outside. Supper's at 5 in the bunkhouse." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. "One thing, Mr. Everett, we don't tolerate troublemakers here. No fighting, no excessive drinking, and absolutely no disrespect toward me or any other woman on this property." "Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Miss Montgomery." "Good. Then welcome to Diamond M." The bunkhouse was clean and well built, with a dozen bunks, a large cook stove, and a table long enough to accommodate all the hands at once. Currently, it was mostly empty, with only 3 men present: Ben, whom he'd met earlier, an older Mexican man called Paco who appeared to be the cook, and a young cowboy introduced as Charlie, left behind due to a recent injury. "Rest of the boys will be back by supper," Ben explained, showing Holden to an empty bunk. "Foreman's name is Jack. Been with the Montgomerys since before Miss Grace was born. He runs a tight outfit." "What's the work like?" Holden asked, stowing his few possessions. "Fair but hard. Winter's coming early this year. We'll be busy getting the herd ready, mending fences, stockpiling feed." Ben paused. "Miss Grace, she expects a lot, but she works harder than any of us. Her daddy was the same way before his accident." "What happened there?" "Horse spooked and threw him against a fence post, broke his back. Doctors said he'd never walk again. Miss Grace took over that same day, hasn't looked back since." Holden nodded thoughtfully. "Must have been difficult for her." "She's tougher than she looks," Ben replied. "Had to be. Plenty of folks around here didn't think a woman could run a ranch this size. She's proved 'em wrong at every turn." As promised, the rest of the crew returned by supper, 8 more men, dusty and tired from a day's hard work. Jack, the foreman, was a barrel-chested man with a gray, streaked beard and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Holden with a firm handshake and a series of direct questions about his experience. Satisfied with the answers, Jack outlined the next day's work. "We start at dawn. Everett, you'll ride with me and Ben. Need to move the last of the herd to the north pasture before that storm hits." The storm Jack mentioned was evident in the gathering clouds and the restless way the horses moved in the corral. Holden had seen enough prairie weather to recognize the signs of a significant change coming. If they were lucky, it would hold off until they'd moved the cattle. Luck, however, was not on their side. The men rose before dawn to find the world transformed by an early-season snowfall not deep yet, but steadily accumulating. Jack cursed colorfully, but insisted they proceed as planned. "Cattle need to be moved," he said grimly. "Snow or no snow." They rode out as the gray light of dawn filtered through the falling snow. Holden, bundled in his coat with a scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face, followed Jack and Ben toward the southern pasture where the remaining cattle waited. The work was grueling, cold, wet, and exhausting. The cattle were reluctant to move in the unfamiliar conditions, requiring constant vigilance to keep them headed in the right direction. By midday, the snow was falling more heavily, reducing visibility and making the already difficult task nearly impossible. "We need to push through." Jack shouted over the wind. "Can't leave them out here." Holden had seen cattle die in less severe weather. The foreman was right, they needed to get the herd to the sheltered north pasture or risk significant losses. He urged Buck forward, helping to keep the jittery animals moving despite the deteriorating conditions. The day wore on, and the temperature continued to drop. Holden's hands were numb despite his gloves, and Buck was struggling through the accumulating snow. Just as they were nearing the north pasture, a sudden gust of wind spooked the lead steer, causing it to veer sharply to the right. In moments, the entire herd was scattering. "Cut them off," Jack yelled, spurring his horse toward the fleeing animals. Holden reacted instinctively, directing Buck to the left to intercept a group of cattle heading toward a steep ravine. The horse responded admirably, placing himself between the cattle and the dangerous drop-off. One by one, the steers turned back, rejoining the main group. All except for one, a large bull that seemed determined to go its own way. Holden pursued it, aware of the treacherous ground and the worsening visibility. The bull charged through a screen of snow-laden bushes, with Buck close behind. Without warning, the ground beneath them gave way, a snow-covered embankment collapsing under their combined weight. Holden felt Buck stumble, and then they were falling. He had just enough time to kick his feet free of the stirrups before they hit the ground 10 feet below. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. For several moments, he lay stunned, aware only of the cold seeping through his clothes and the sound of Buck struggling to his feet nearby. When he tried to rise, a sharp pain shot through his left leg. "Damn it," he muttered, gritting his teeth as he probed the injury. Not broken, he thought, but badly twisted or sprained. He managed to stand, putting most of his weight on his right leg. Buck stood nearby, apparently uninjured but clearly anxious. Holden looked up at the embankment. Climbing back up was impossible in his condition. They would have to find another way out of the ravine if there was one. The snow was falling so heavily now that he could barely see 10 feet ahead. With no better option, he took Buck's reins and began limping forward, following the course of the ravine. If it was a creek bed, as he suspected, it had to lead somewhere. Time lost meaning as he struggled through the snow, each step sending fresh pain through his injured leg. The cold seeped deeper, and he found himself fighting to stay alert. Buck trudged alongside him, occasionally nudging him as if encouraging him to keep moving. Just as Holden was beginning to fear they were hopelessly lost, the ravine widened, and through the curtain of snow, he glimpsed a structure, a small cabin set back among a stand of pine trees. Smoke rose from its chimney, a beacon of hope in the worsening storm. With renewed determination, he made his way toward it, practically dragging his injured leg by the time he reached the cabin door. He pounded on it, too exhausted and cold to consider what kind of reception he might receive. The door swung open to reveal a woman, her expression changing from surprise to concern as she took in his condition. "Good Lord," she exclaimed. "Get inside before you freeze to death." Holden stumbled across the threshold, bringing a swirl of snow with him. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a physical force, making his cold, numbed extremities prickle painfully. "Your horse," the woman said, already pulling on a coat. "I'll put him in the lean-to." "Thank you," Holden managed, his voice rough from cold and exertion. He sank onto a chair near the stove, unable to stand any longer. When the woman returned, she moved with efficient purpose, helping him remove his snow-covered coat and boots. "You're hurt," she observed, noticing his favoring of the left leg. "Fell down an embankment," Holden explained. "Horse and I both. He seems all right, though." "You're lucky you found my place. Not many would in this weather." She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "I'm Gabriella Morris. Most folks call me Gabi. Holden Everett. I work at the Diamond M Ranch, or I did as of yesterday." Gabi smiled, a quick quirk of her lips that transformed her serious face. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid and clear blue eyes that regarded him with intelligent assessment. She wore a simple dress of brown wool with a white apron over it, practical clothing for a woman living alone in the wilderness. "You picked quite a day for your first cattle drive," she remarked, moving to the stove where a pot bubbled. "This storm came in faster than anyone expected. Here, drink this." She handed him a cup of hot coffee, liberally laced with something stronger. Holden took it gratefully, the warmth spreading through him as he drank. "Let me look at that leg," Gabi said, kneeling beside his chair. Her hands were gentle but firm as she rolled up his pant leg to examine the injury. "Nasty sprain, I think. I'll wrap it for you, but you won't be riding anywhere for a few days." "I need to let them know I'm alive," Holden said, thinking of the ranch. "They'll be searching. In this." Gabi gestured toward the window, where the snow continued to fall heavily. "No one's searching for anything in this weather. The best thing you can do is rest and wait it out." She proved to be right. The storm raged for 2 more days, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow across the prairie. During that time, Holden was confined to Gabi's cabin, a cozy one-room structure she had built herself 3 years earlier. "My father taught me everything he knew about surviving out here," she explained on the second evening as they sat by the stove, sharing a simple meal of rabbit stew. He was a trapper, came out west after the war and never went back east. What happened to him? Holden asked, noting the past tense. Influenza took him winter before last, she replied, a shadow crossing her face. It was quick, at least. He didn't suffer long. And you stayed on alone. She nodded, her chin lifting slightly. This is my home. I know how to hunt, how to keep warm, how to defend myself if needed. In town, what would I be? A seamstress, a housekeeper. Someone's wife. The words held a challenge, as if she expected him to argue. Instead, Holden nodded. Independence means different things to different people. Gabi studied him for a moment. You understand that better than most, I suspect. You've got the look of someone who's been moving a long time. Since the war, he admitted. Never could settle afterward. What were you before? Farmer's son. Was supposed to inherit the family place in Kentucky. He stared into his cup. After Shiloh, I couldn't go back to that life. Too quiet, too confined. So you've been wandering ever since. It wasn't a question, more or less. Ranch work suited me. Different places, different people, but the work itself is familiar. And nowhere to call home, she observed. Holden shrugged. Home is where I lay my head. Always figured that was enough. Gabi didn't respond immediately, her attention turning to the stove where she carefully adjusted the damper. The simple action, the way her hands moved with such confidence and care, caught Holden's attention more than it should have. Most folks don't understand why I live out here alone, she said finally. They think a woman needs a man's protection, a man's provision. But this stove keeps me warm, this cabin keeps me dry, and this, she touched the rifle propped near the door, keeps me safe. Seems like you've built something worth having, Holden said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. She looked at him then, a long, assessing look that made him strangely self-conscious. Maybe, she said softly, but it gets quiet sometimes. On the morning of the third day, the storm finally broke. Holden stood on Gabi's small porch, testing his injured leg. It was still painful but could bear his weight now. Buck, well rested in the lean-to, nickered a greeting. You should be able to make it back to the ranch today, Gabi said, joining him outside. The fresh snow sparkled in the sunlight, transforming the landscape into something clean and new. If you follow the creek, it'll lead you straight there. I appreciate everything you've done, Holden said, suddenly awkward. 3 days in her company had passed with surprising ease, filled with conversation and comfortable silences alike. The thought of returning to the bunkhouse and the company of rough cowboys held less appeal than it should have. It was nothing, she replied with that quick smile that had become familiar. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone, he countered. Not out here. She handed him a small package wrapped in cloth, some food for the ride, and this, she pressed a small tin into his hand, for your leg. Apply it morning and night until the swelling is gone completely. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a brief contact that nonetheless sent an unexpected warmth through him. Holden found himself studying her face, the dusting of freckles across her nose, the slight unevenness to her front teeth, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Not conventionally beautiful, perhaps, but striking in a way that made it difficult to look away. Thank you, he said, aware that the words were inadequate. Gabi nodded, stepping back. Be careful riding. The snow hides all sorts of hazards. Holden mounted Buck with some difficulty, settling into the saddle with a grimace. He looked down at Gabi, standing in the snow with her arms crossed against the cold. Maybe I could come back sometime, he heard himself say. When my leg's better, bring you some supplies from town or help with repairs around the place. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something warmer. I'd like that, Mr. Everett, Holden, he corrected. Just Holden. Holden then. She smiled fully this time. I'll hold you to that offer. The ride back to the Diamond M took longer than expected, with Buck having to pick his way carefully through the deep snow. By the time Holden rode into the ranch yard, the sun was already low in the western sky. His arrival caused an immediate stir. Ben was the first to spot him, shouting to the others as Holden dismounted gingerly in front of the bunkhouse. "Everett, where the hell have you been? We thought you were dead." Jack and several other cowboys emerged from the bunkhouse, their expressions a mix of relief and astonishment. Even Grace Montgomery appeared on the porch of the main house, hurrying down the steps toward them. "What happened?" Jack demanded. "We looked for you until the snow got too bad." Holden explained about the fall and finding shelter at Gabi's cabin. His account was met with nods of understanding. Survival sometimes depended on the kindness of strangers in this harsh land. "Morris woman, eh?" one of the cowboys remarked. "Strange one, her. Lives out there all alone like some kind of hermit." "She saved my life," Holden said sharply. Nothing strange about offering shelter to someone in need. The man raised his hands placatingly. "No offense meant. Just saying it ain't natural for a woman to live that way." Before Holden could respond, Grace Montgomery intervened. "We're just glad you're safe, Mr. Everett, Doctor. Wilson is in the house treating my father for a cold. You should have him look at that leg." The ranch quickly settled back into its routine, though Holden was limited to light duties around the barn until his leg healed completely. The winter had come early and promised to be a hard one, with the first storm just a preview of what was to come. 2 weeks passed before Holden was able to make good on his promise to visit Gabi. He rode out one clear, cold morning with his saddlebags filled with coffee, sugar, flour, and other staples from the general store in Clearwater. Ben had given him directions that made the journey much simpler than his first snow-blind stumbling to her door. Gabi was chopping wood when he arrived, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She straightened when she saw him, pushing a strand of hair from her face with a gloved hand. "You came back," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I said I would." Holden dismounted, pleased to find his leg almost completely healed. "Brought some things from town." She eyed the bulging saddlebags. "I don't need charity, Mr. Everett." "Not charity," he corrected. "Payment for saving my hide, and I thought we agreed on Holden." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "So we did. Well, come inside then. It's too cold to stand around arguing." Over the next few months, Holden's visits to Gabi's cabin became regular weekly when weather permitted, sometimes with practical supplies, other times simply for conversation and companionship. He helped her with repairs to the lean-to, hunted with her when game was scarce, and once, during a particularly bitter cold snap, stayed 3 days to ensure she had enough firewood to survive the plummeting temperatures. At the Diamond M, his position had evolved from temporary hand to valued employee. His experience and literacy made him useful to Grace Montgomery, who increasingly relied on him for tasks beyond the typical cowboy duties. By spring, he had been promoted to assistant foreman, with a corresponding increase in pay and responsibility. Yet it was the hours spent at Gabi's cabin that Holden found himself anticipating most. Something about the small, neat space she had created felt more welcoming than any place he'd known in years. Or perhaps it was the woman herself, competent, independent, quietly funny, who drew him back time and again. As winter reluctantly loosened its grip on the prairie, Holden arrived one evening to find Gabi kneeling in a newly turned patch of earth beside her cabin, carefully planting seeds. "Garden?" he asked, crouching beside her. She nodded. "Peas and potatoes go in first." Then beans, corn, squash when it warms more. She glanced at him. My mother taught me, before she died, I mean, said a good garden was as important as a good rifle out here. Smart woman, Holden remarked, watching as Gabi's fingers created a small furrow in the dark soil. She was, Gabi agreed softly. Wish she could have seen this place. She always wanted a home of her own. Something in her voice made Holden look at her more closely. You miss her. Every day. Gabi continued planting, not meeting his eyes. She died when I was 15. Fever. My father and we came west after that. He couldn't bear to stay where everything reminded him of her. I'm sorry, Holden said, aware of the inadequacy of the words. Gabi shrugged, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of deflecting difficult emotions. It was a long time ago. What about your family? You never talk about them. Holden hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing the past he usually kept carefully locked away. But something about the moment, the fresh smell of turned earth, the gentle way Gabi's hands cradled the seeds loosened the tight grip he maintained on those memories. My mother died when I was young, too. My father remarried a few years later. She was kind enough, I suppose. My brother and I worked the farm with my father. It was a good life, mostly. Until the war, Gabi prompted gently. Until the war, he agreed. My brother died at Bull Run. I was wounded at Shiloh, spent months in a field hospital. By the time I made it home, my father had died of influenza. My stepmother had sold the farm and moved back east with her family. So you had nowhere to go. I had the farm payment, what was left after the sale, enough to buy a decent horse and gear. Started drifting then. Never really stopped. Gabi sat back on her heels, studying him. And you've never wanted to stop, to build something of your own? The question struck deeper than he expected. Never saw the point, he admitted. One place is much like another. Is it? She gestured around them at the cabin, the garden plot, the small corral where she kept 2 goats and a mule. This is mine. Every board, every nail, every seed. I built it. That matters. Holden considered her words as they finished planting in companionable silence. By the time they went inside, twilight was settling over the prairie, and a chill wind had risen from the north. Gabi lit the lamps and added wood to the stove while Holden hung his coat on a peg by the door. The familiar ritual struck him suddenly, the ease with which they moved around each other in the small space, the comfort he felt in her presence. When had her cabin begun to feel more like home than his quarters at the ranch? As if reading his thoughts, Gabi turned from the stove to find him watching her. What? She asked, a hint of self-consciousness in her voice. Nothing, he said, then reconsidered. No, not nothing. I was just thinking that I like it here. A flush of pink touched her cheeks. It's not much, she said, gesturing around the modest cabin, but it's comfortable enough. It's not the cabin, Holden said quietly. It's you. The words hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Gabi's eyes widened slightly, then she ducked her head, busying herself with preparations for their meal. You're just used to bunkhouse living, she said lightly. Any place with decent food and clean floors would seem appealing. But when she turned to the table with plates in hand, her eyes met his, and the connection between them was undeniable. Something had shifted, a door opening to possibilities neither had acknowledged before. That evening, their conversation flowed as easily as ever, though an undercurrent of awareness ran beneath it. When it came time for Holden to leave, Gabi walked him to the door as usual. Be careful riding back in the dark, she said, her standard farewell. But instead of simply nodding as he typically did, Holden found himself reaching for her hand. Gabi, he said, his voice unexpectedly rough. I meant what I said earlier. She looked up at him, her expression a complex mixture of hope and caution. People say things they don't always mean, Not me, he replied. Not to you. For a long moment they stood in silence, his hand still holding hers. Then, with a boldness that surprised him, Gabi raised herself on tiptoes and pressed a kiss to his cheek, brief but unmistakably deliberate. "Good night, Holden," she murmured, stepping back. "Come back soon." The ride back to the Diamond M that night seemed longer than usual, though Buck knew the way well enough by now. Holden's thoughts were filled with Gabi, her smile, her capable hands, the feeling of her lips against his cheek. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about the future as something more than just the next job or the next town. Spring brought a flurry of activity to the ranch as calving season began in earnest. Holden worked long hours, often returning to his quarters too exhausted for anything but sleep. Still, he made time to visit Gabi when he could, sometimes arriving at her cabin just as dawn was breaking after a night spent with a difficult calving. She never seemed to mind the odd hours, always welcoming him with coffee and whatever food she had on hand. Their relationship continued to deepen, evolving from friendship to something neither of them had put a name to yet. One warm May evening, Holden arrived at her cabin to find Gabi sitting on the porch steps, mending a shirt. She looked up at the sound of Buck's approach, her face lighting with a smile that made his heart beat faster. "You're early today," she said as he dismounted. "No emergencies at the ranch." "Not today," he replied. "Jack gave me the afternoon off, said I'd been working too hard." "Sensible man." Gabi set aside her sewing as Holden joined her on the steps. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten the way here." "Not likely," he said, settling beside her. Their shoulders brushed, a casual contact that nonetheless sent warmth through him. "Garden's looking good," Gabi nodded, pride evident in her expression as she surveyed the neat rows of emerging plants. "Should be a good crop if the weather holds." "I was thinking of putting up another bed over there for herbs." "I could help with that," Holden offered. "Next time I come, I'd like that." She turned to look at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "You look tired." "Been a busy few weeks," he admitted, "but worth it." "Grace says it's the best calving season they've had in years." "She's lucky to have you," Gabi said, a note in her voice he couldn't quite interpret. "You say that like you don't believe it." Gabi looked away, her fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on her skirt. "I just wonder sometimes if you'll get restless again. You said yourself you never stay in one place long." The question caught him off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "That was before," he said slowly. "Before what?" "Before here. Before you." Holden took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. "I've been thinking about what you said about building something that matters." Gabi's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. "There's a piece of land for sale," he continued, "about 3 miles west of here. Good water, decent grazing. Been saving my wages, thought I might make an offer." "You want to start your own ranch?" Gabi asked, surprise evident in her voice. "I want to build something," he corrected. "Something that lasts, something that's mine." He paused, gathering his courage. "Something that could be ours, if you wanted that too." The words hung in the air between them. Gabi's expression shifted from surprise to uncertainty to something softer, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen on her face. "Holden," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I love you," he replied, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Have for a while now. Just took me time to recognize it for what it was." Gabi's eyes glistened with sudden tears. "I never thought I hoped," but Holden reached for her hand, his heart pounding. "I know it's sudden. We don't have to decide anything right now. I just wanted you to know where I stand, what I want." "It's not sudden," she contradicted, her fingers tightening around his. "Not for me. I've loved you since that night you came back, just like you promised, when you brought coffee and sugar and acted like it was nothing special." Joy surged through him, bright and unexpected. "Is that a yes, then? To what?" she teased, though her smile told him everything he needed to know. "You haven't actually asked me anything." Holden laughed, suddenly feeling lighter than he had in years. "Fair enough." He shifted to face her more directly. "Gabriella Morris, will you marry me, build a life with me?" "Yes," she said simply. "I will." Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Holden rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that months ago," he murmured. Gabi laughed softly. "We got there eventually." The days that followed were filled with plans and preparations. Holden made an offer on the land, which was quickly accepted. He gave notice at the Diamond M, though he agreed to stay until Grace could find a suitable replacement. And most importantly, arrangements were made for a simple wedding in Clearwater, with only a few witnesses from the ranch and town. 2 weeks before the wedding, Holden rode to Gabi's cabin with exciting news. The previous owner of the land had agreed to include his small herd of cattle in the sale, 30 head, not many by Diamond M standards, but enough for a start. "We'll need to build a proper house," he said as they walked the property together. "Something bigger than your cabin. Room to grow." Gabi squeezed his hand, her eyes dancing with happiness. "I'd like that, though I want to keep my cabin too. It was my first real home." "Of course," Holden agreed. "It can be a guest house or a place to store preserves or whatever you want." They stopped on a small rise that overlooked a bend in the creek. The land spread out before them, green and promising in the late spring sunshine. "Here," Gabi said suddenly. "This is where the house should be. Morning sun in the kitchen, sunset view from the porch." Holden looked at the spot, then at the woman beside him. Her face was animated with vision and purpose, already seeing the home that didn't yet exist. In that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. "You know," he said, pulling her close, "I spent years wandering, thinking home was just wherever I happened to be. Never understood what people meant when they talked about belonging somewhere." Gabi wrapped her arms around his waist, looking up at him. "And now I know better," he said softly. "Home isn't a place, it's a feeling. It's coming in from the cold to find the stove lit and someone waiting who's glad to see you." "Someone who loves you," Gabi added. "Someone who loves me," he agreed, bending to kiss her. "Someone I love back." Their wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect June morning. The ceremony was held in the small church in Clearwater, with Mrs. Peterson, Grace and Marcus Montgomery, Jack, Ben, and a few other hands from the Diamond M in attendance. Gabi wore a simple blue dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Holden found himself unable to take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. The vows were traditional, but spoken with a depth of feeling that brought tears to more than one observer's eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Holden kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the passion he felt, aware of their audience but unable to completely hide his emotions. The celebration afterward was held at the Diamond M, where Grace had insisted on hosting a proper reception. There was music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the county. As the evening progressed, Holden found himself standing on the porch with Marcus Montgomery, watching as Gabi danced with Jack, her laughter carrying across the yard. "Never thought I'd see the day," Marcus remarked, leaning heavily on his cane. "You settling down, I mean." "Grace said from the start you had that restless look about you." Holden smiled, acknowledging the truth in the observation. "I did. For a long time, thought that's just how I was made. And now I know better," Holden replied, his eyes still on Gabi. "Just needed the right reason to stay put." Marcus nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "Well, you've got yourself a fine woman there. Smart, strong, knows her own mind." "That she does," Holden agreed. "Luckiest day of my life was when that storm blew me to her door." Later that night, after the last of the guests had departed, and they had ridden to Gabi's cabin, their temporary home, until the new house was built, Holden carried his bride across the threshold in the traditional manner. Inside, the stove was already lit, casting a warm glow throughout the small space. "Welcome home, husband," Gabi said softly, her arms still around his neck. Holden set her gently on her feet, looking around at the cabin that had come to mean so much to him. "You know," he said, "when I was a boy, my mother used to say that a house isn't a home until there's a fire in the hearth and love in the hearts of those who dwell there." Gabi smiled up at him, her eyes shining in the soft light. "Wise woman, your mother." "She would have liked you," Holden said, drawing Gabi closer. "Almost as much as I do." "Only almost," Gabi teased, her fingers playing with the buttons of his shirt. Holden chuckled, bending to kiss her. "Well, I do have certain advantages in that regard." As the night deepened around them, Holden Everett finally understood what he'd been searching for all those years of wandering. It wasn't a place on any map, or a purpose grand enough to give meaning to his existence. It was the simple, profound connection to another soul, the feeling of belonging that came not from four walls and a roof, but from the heart of the woman who had waited for him to find his way home. And as he held Gabi in his arms, watching the firelight dance across her sleeping face in the pre-dawn hours, Holden made a silent promise to never take for granted the miracle they had found together. The journey that had begun with a snowstorm and an injured leg had led him to a destination he'd never thought to seek, not just a home, but a heart to share it with. In the years that followed, the Everetts built their ranch into a modest but prosperous operation. The house Holden constructed on the rise overlooking the creek became known throughout the region for its warmth and hospitality. Children came first, a son they named Marcus, after the old rancher who had given Holden his chance in Clearwater, and then twin daughters who inherited their mother's determination and their father's restless curiosity. And though life on the frontier remained challenging, with droughts and blizzards and all the unpredictable hardships of the West, Holden never again felt the urge to move on. He had found what he hadn't known. He was searching for a woman who lit not just his stove but his heart, and taught him that home was wherever they faced life together,